Bayani Warrior Podcast, Episode 11. What is Kali with Guro Joey Marana? All right, everybody, and welcome to episode 11 of the Bayani Warrior Podcast. I am your host, Guro Mike Pana, chief instructor and founder of the Bayani Warrior Martial Arts Academy, located right here in the sunny Dallas, Texas area. In today's episode, we're going to talk to my very dear friend, Guro Joey Marana. Guro Joey and I go way back. We actually met at a Sayakali Sama-Sama several years ago. And over the years, we've kept in touch, not just as Filipino martial arts training partners in the Sayak and Atienza tribes, but also as just good friends. We talk about fatherhood, faith, martial arts, of course. And in this episode, we'll actually just be sitting down and talking about the identity of what it means to be a Filipino martial arts practitioner, as well as what it means to have a true Filipino martial art. We also talk about themes such as Filipino-American Identity, which is very fitting for the month of October, being that it is Filipino-American History Month. So without further ado, here's my interview with Guro Joey Marana. Hey, brother. What's going on, man?
Not too much, man. Just busy. How about you? How have you been?
I'm good, man. I'm glad to have you on, and I know this is way overdue. I've been listening to your podcast. By the way, I'm going to put that in the show notes to make sure that everybody has that. But for everyone listening, this is Guro Joey Marana from Baltimore, Maryland. He is actually a good friend of mine from the Sayak tribe. We've been training for quite some time now, although it's been a few years since we've hung out and trained with each other. But we definitely have been keeping in touch, talking about fatherhood and FMA and all those cool things. And so today's episode, we're just going to discuss something that's close to our heart, and it's kind of the state of where Kali and our niece in Eskrima is right now. We always have these discussions, and we figured it'd probably be best if we held this on a podcast. So one of the things, I'm not sure if you've actually experienced this, so one of the first things I want to kind of discuss today, and I'm not sure if you've experienced this yourself, but what I'm getting this question all the time, like, what is Kali? I think people are very familiar with martial arts. I think there's even, years ago, people were hearing about Filipino martial arts. But when I mention Kali here in Texas or anywhere I go, I kind of feel like I have to do this description of what I do. It's like, usually the conversation probably goes like this. It's like, I do martial arts. It's like, what kind of martial art do you do? Is it like karate? And I say, well, no, not really. What is it called? It's called Kali. And then I have to go through this whole Wikipedia-ish spiel, right, about how it goes. So,
Yep.
In your experience, what has been your experience being a Kali practitioner? How has it affected the way you interact with other martial artists? And how do you explain what Kali is to outside people?
Well, I think just like with, probably with anything through our life or through our lives, what Kali is to me and what it means to me, I think has evolved through different stages. And so certainly there's a side where Kali is sort of the, for lack of a better generalization, like the martial art or the martial art systems of the Philippines or Filipino Americans. And, it's kind of a very broad thing.
Yeah.
So actually today, because we did this pilot program for a Filipino cultural school in Baltimore, and even kids and even their parents who are who would be like our peers, they don't really know what Kali is. And so a lot of times I will start it off and say, who has ever heard of Kung Fu? Who has heard of karate? Who has heard of whatever, and whatever kind of martial art. And then I'll ask them, well, where do you think Kung Fu comes from, or where does karate come from? Where does Taekwondo come from? And people will say the different countries. And in general, I will, as an introduction, I'll just say Kali or Filipino martial arts or whatever term there is from the Philippines. I'll say that's the name of the martial arts that came from the Philippines. And that is true. And I believe, even though that's a simple version for me to explain what Kali is, that's what I hold it to be. But personally, it means a lot more. And so, I think through the years, obviously, and there's so much, I wouldn't sometimes disagreement, but there's some debate as to the terminology of Kali or Eskrima or niece and all these other things. But I think some of the things that have been universal to me, whether it's Sayo Kali, Atienza Kali, Guru Dan, the Inosanto method of Filipino martial arts, whatever it is. I do use a lot of Tohon Rafael Kayanan's terminology and descriptors because I feel like they best articulate what I'm trying to describe and what I'm trying to say. And obviously, that's a huge influence on the way I conceptualize things. But Kali to me is also like the movement language and like personality and culture of basically martial expression that started or was influenced by the Philippines. Obviously, you and I train in systems that were not necessarily born and cradled and nurtured to grow up in the Philippines. I mean, they may have had roots there, but just like with most things too, they've evolved. But I also think that Filipino martial arts in general, whether it's Kali or whatever term people are using, certainly there's the element of like motion, and there's the element of like play, and I don't want to say like universality, but like universals. So whether we learn like a palm stick, we can translate to tactical flashlight or tactical pen or a regular flashlight or a regular pen, what it would be. And then I had an instructor like many years ago that he was like, Joe, eskrima is mastery of the weapon. Whatever the weapon is, the weapon could just be your own hands. But he described it, and I was heavily influenced by this too. This was Guru Ramon Rubia of San Miguel and Doce Paras. He was like, eskrima is mastery of the weapon, mastery of weaponry, but it's also the concept that back in the day they would talk about how arnis was a derivative of arnés, like a harness, like a Spanish harness or trapping. And Guru Dan talks about how Kali, the terminology that he uses, Kali, comes from Floro Villabreo that combine, and not just Villabreo, but like the instructors that combine Kamwat and Lihok, or Mai and Likot to make Kali. So it's sort of like a hand motion or body motion. So Guru Ramon was saying that like this idea of motion is not just like the motion of the technique, but the motion itself is the armor, it's the shield, it's the weapon. So instead of purely just a physical shield or a tangible, blade or whatever, it's the movement themselves that are both the weapons as well as the protective trappings, if you will.
Right. That's really good because, I had a student recently, Brian, shout out to you if you're listening to this, but he actually asked me a few months ago, he actually posed this very interesting question. And the reason I bring this question up is because I think it kind of forced me to kind of find the real root of what Kali is if I had to describe it. And so his question was kind of interesting. He basically said, well, let's say, hypothetically speaking, you got a Filipino guy from the Philippines, right? And he was a quote-unquote Kali master or arnisador or whatever. And now this guy immigrates to China. And now he lives in China, and he marries a Chinese woman, and he teaches his children who are half Chinese this Kali system. And 100 years passes, this system is handed down generation by generation. Is it now Kung Fu at the end of that, right? It was a really interesting question. I was like, man, I really got to think about this. So he was asking me this in terms of, what defines Filipino martial arts? I mean, really, what is to say that this is Filipino and this is not? And you're probably familiar with this too, because if you read books like Filipino Martial Culture, or if you go to even in the Philippines today, I was in the Philippines last summer around this time, and Filipinos overall in the Philippines don't really care about Filipino martial arts. They don't really care about eskrima or arnis. For the most part, they're into taekwondo. They're into Brazilian jiu-jitsu is a huge thing there now. And it kind of makes you wonder, well, is a Filipino doing Brazilian jiu-jitsu in the Philippines? Technically, isn't that a Filipino martial art, right? And so I thought about it, and I said, well, I got to narrow it down to, three main things. For me, when people ask me now what Kali is, I say simply it is whatever answers or solves the problem that is presented in front of you at the time. So, and the reason I say that is because we as Filipino-Americans, I mean, you and I look at Filipino martial arts through a very different lens, right? Like we look at it like, oh, there's this warrior culture we're part of, and this art enables us to kind of, connect to this very primal, very ancient way that our ancestors did, which kind of fortifies us and kind of connects us to our past. And also teaches us, self-defense and all these other things, combatives. But, when I was talking to some Filipino guys over in the Philippines, as well as elders of mine in my family, as well as my friends' families, there was this one individual I met. He was actually a soldier during World War II. He passed away about 3 or 4 years ago, but he said to me, he's like, I don't understand why you train with bolos. This is an old Filipino man. Maybe he must have been 78 at the time. And I said, well, why? Like, weren't you in World War II? You must have seen this. He's like, yeah, but you didn't fight with a bolo. I mean, I had 245s. Why would I fight with a bolo if I had 245s? And so I'm thinking, like, well, technically, that's what solves the problem. He had what he had, right? But is it Kali? And I know that we can't say it is, per se, but the Filipino mindset behind fighting is that it is whatever solves the problem that's in front of me right now. So if all I have is a bolo and there's a guy with a blade, that's what I'm going to use. Or if this guy has a rifle and all I have is a spear or a sword, this is what I have to use to solve this problem. However, I'm pretty sure if I can go back in time with 20 Glocks and give it to like a bunch of natives, or like, Indios, quote unquote, during the revolution, the Filipino-American Revolution, you know what I mean? During the Spanish War there, I'm pretty sure that would change the game. They probably would have been like, oh, forget these. I'm getting these Glocks, So for me, Filipino martial arts at the core, it has to be something that solves a problem, and that problem is violence, right? Filipinos aren't really big on, as you probably know this, they're not very big on necessarily documenting their martial art or organizing it. And if you look at most systems outside of the Sayak tribe or out of the Atienza tribe, they're not very well organized. I mean, they're pretty haphazard. I mean, in America, we understand curriculum, we understand progression and curriculum, but in the Philippines, it was like, okay, well, here it is. Here's a stick. Here's a blade. Here's some angles. Okay, now learn this stuff, drill a little bit, and next week we go to war.
Yeah.
So there's this element of it has to work. We don't care about lineage or whatever. This is just something that we use. I mean, when I would speak to my father, he had some street experience back in the Philippines. His whole thing was, we didn't carry knives because people would search us. Our teachers would search our backpacks. They would pat us down. It was like one of those things. So the way he solved that problem was, let's get some spin tops, those wooden spin tops, shave down the blades, the nails in them, and those are going to be our fist loads. I want to punch people in the face with those. Nice. That was his mindset. That was their mindset. His whole crew of guys, his barcada, that's their whole thing. They all carried spin tops, which is kind of interesting because, we're spending, we got blades. I got barongs and bolos and all these live blades. And then my dad's like, no, I carried this. And it's a spin top, out of all things. And so for me, at the core of it, it has to work. It has to be functional. It has to solve whatever problem is there at the time. And the second thing, it has to be based upon some kind of blade. It has to be bladed at the core, because if you look at most Filipino martial arts now that are stick-based, they can kind of assume a structure almost karate-ish, almost taekwondo-ish, right? You've probably seen this. But the moment you put a blade in there, and they're not, just sayang with a blade. I mean, they're fighting, something else has to come out. There has to be a different level of skill and intent. And so at some point, I don't care what the system is. Of course, we come from, the two top blade systems, Saka and Atienza. We see this through a very specific lens. But even outside of those realms, I feel that a true Filipino martial art has to be blade based. Not to say that's the only thing that they do, but it has to kind of go back to that at some point. So number one, it has to work. It has to solve whatever problems in front of you. Two, the blade has to be there. It has to be blade based in some capacity. It has to have some level of where if I give this guy a blade, he'll know how to use it properly. And the third thing I would say it has, and this is something that's very specific to our Saka and Atienza training, which really lit the light bulb in my mind about this. It has to be family based. And I'm not saying it has to be just bloodline, but I'm saying like what we're taught in Atienza Kali, what makes that system particularly different is that it's not about how good you are with a blade. It's also about how you use that blade in interaction with the people in your tribe. Yeah. Are your kids trained to some level? Are your elders, are they aware of what you do? It's how you integrate everything together, like I remember there was this one scenario that Carl presented. I think it was to our friend Irvin Kinton over in Virginia Beach on one of his podcast episodes. And I remember he was saying, it's like, okay, well, you're great with a blade. Okay, awesome. Now, what if you have to run from a gang and now you have your like 58-year-old diabetic aunt with you? And you have to protect her. How good are you then? So it's an interaction with how it works with the family. So And traditionally, Filipino martial arts was really just taught within the family or to friends of the family. And it didn't matter if they were Filipino or not, right? It had to be within your circle or your barkada, right? So I think that's how I would describe it. And I know that it's kind of tough because I try to explain this to people, and you still got to go through this whole speech about what it is. But at the core, it has to work. The blade's involved, and it has to involve the family. It has to be brought in. And I really like what you said earlier about is the mastery of weaponry. Because so many people, like I just came from the Kickstart Kids conference, which 98% of them are Taekwondo, Hapkido, Tang Sudo, karate black belts. And I'm the one guy who does Kali. I'm not a karate guy. I don't wear a gi. I didn't even know how to put on a gi until I started this job. I didn't know any of that. And here I am with all these individuals, and they're like, oh yeah, Kali, awesome. That's cool. Anyway, or it's relegated to just like, oh, I do the double stick drill. What's it called? Heaven, Earth? What is it called? It's like they relegate it to just a drill, or they relegate it to just, a move that they know. But they don't realize that there's this entire combative art that's behind that thing. And so that's why I think it's so important to know what it is. So when we explain it, they see, oh, wait a second, this is not an add-on art. This is not just a supplemental art. This is my art. You know what I'm saying?
It's interesting. I mean, this is like a big, I feel like this ties into like a whole bunch of things. So I'm going to go all over the place for a minute here.
Go for it.
And I remember like really venting to a good friend of mine. And I was like, this is rap. This is not hip hop. And he was like, well, you can't say that it's not hip hop. And I'd be like, well, it doesn't fall into like this culture and this theme and this attitude of hip hop, which was born and cradled in the Bronx, in New York, and these 5 elements of like rhyming and DJing and b-boying and graffiti, all the whole gamut. And he's like, well, just because it doesn't fit into your definition and construct of hip hop doesn't mean that's not hip hop. And that was like a big check for me because I thought, I was like a young kid, but I was like in the scene, I'd go to all these battles, like Black Book that I'd have these like graffiti guys to write in and stuff. And so I felt like I had some authority to say, I was very proud of my idea that I wasn't like an observer, that I wasn't a bystander to hip hop, that I was a participant. I helped create and perpetuate the culture. That was my belief at the time. I'm not anymore. I'm just a fan, right? I'm just like, I'm not even plugged in. I'm like not in the matrix at all.
Yeah.
But that was like a big check for me. The other thing too is it's very reminiscent of all these like weird, very personal and heated debates sometimes about like, well, what is Jeet Kune Do? Right. Because if you just read the Tao of Jeet Kune Do and you're like, well, just absorb what's useful, discard what's useless, and a lot of people just take it and they just end it there. In reality, it's supposed to, include that you're supposed to research your own experience and add something specifically that's your own. But people will make all kinds of things and be like, well, those guys, they say they're Jeet Kune Do because they trained with Bruce Lee, but they're just doing stuff from 1968. And then meanwhile, there's this joker over here that's wherever, from Virginia or some other place that pretty much does Taekwondo and then tells everyone that he teaches Jeet Kune Do because he read the book. Right. So a lot of people have asked Guru Dan this over the years, like, basically, what is Jeet Kune Do? What do you think Jeet Kune Do is? And I'm not going to go into a whole big thing about all whatever things I remember about his interviews and writings, but he holds firm. I think he holds firm to the fact that whatever the mix or constitution or ratios are, there's some element that still ties it into the Jeet Kune Do that Bruce Lee was teaching and advocating for. But there is an element too that's like that changes with times and all these other things too. Right. So certainly with Kali, I think you can go on both ends of the spectrum. They're like, oh no, Kali, it has to come from the Philippines. It has to come from like Supreme Grandmaster, so and so. Supreme Grandmaster Boy who came from the province, and he only used whatever like farming implement. But then there's this whole other thing that Guru Dan often says that his seniors or his instructors always told him, and I'm going to butcher it, but I will try. Like the phrase, I'll try, and then I'll just say it in English the best that I can remember. But it was like this kind of like a query back and forth. That's like Ano ang Kali?
Hmm.
Ikaw ang Kali. Uh, i- ito ang Kali. This is like a great example of how I'm definitely not Filipino. But it's basically, what is Kali? You are Kali.
Hmm.
This is true Kali. And
Hmm.
so there's an element to, there's a spirit. I wouldn't take it literally that
Hmm.
like the things that we do, it may not match exactly what they did 100 years ago,
Hmm.
um, in Mindanao.
Right.
But what we do, I would probably say what we do influenced by the themes and the things that drive us, kind of like the core universals and principles. Um, Certainly that have to do with weaponry. Certainly
Yeah.
that call and recall the blade.
Right.
Certainly that have to do with motion that are influenced in the Philippines. I think all those things are true. Like I think Kali is all of those things. I don't really think it can be just anything, but I
Right.
certainly think it has to have those elements that you talked about. It's almost like people will like they'll make all these like they think they're like so clever and be like, oh, in Thailand is Thai food, isn't that just called food? Yeah,
Right.
that's
Right.
yes, very very insightful. But
Yeah.
there's like a flavor and a palate to Thai food, and I'm not by any means like a Thai food connoisseur, but like there's like a flavor palette and mixture to Thai food that wherever it is in the world. So if someone had some like pad Thai recipe and they went to China, but they kept it, and that pad Thai recipe existed for generations or hundreds of years in China, would it then be lo mein or would it be pad Thai? I
Right.
would probably argue that it's still pad Thai.
Right.
Like maybe in China they'd call it lo mein because that's what it is there,
Hmm.
but the origin of it is still pad Thai. Now, can pad Thai be made in other? Of course, it can. And does one family? I'm sure it's just like in the Philippines. Does one family's adobo match another family? No, of course
Right.
not.
Not
That's,
absolutely not.
that's a good example. Filipino food has so much variety, so much variation. People will say like, "What is Filipino food?" Is it a mix between like Spanish cuisine and Chinese cuisine? It is these indigenous things. So adobo. Some people it's like real vinegary and
Yeah.
acidic. Some people it's sweet. Some people have potatoes. Whatever it is,
Yeah.
it's hard really to say like what is Filipino for me as not like a chef or some kind of food connoisseur.
Right.
What is Filipino food or what is adobo even? But we know it has these like basic ingredients. Now, can someone make some weird adobo that I would be like, no, that's like absolutely not adobo. That's the worst thing I've ever tasted. Yeah, I'm sure, but I think
Right.
it would still be in the spirit of adobo. And so at the very least, it would have to harken back to that. Now, if someone changed all the variables and they're like, well, I mean, I guess you could change any variable, but let's say they just made it like tofu, and instead of soy sauce, they just used
Right.
like barbecue sauce. They just changed everything.
Right.
Would it really be a do? Ah,
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, it's there is a framework, right? There is a framework in which we have to kind of stick to, right? Like we can't just call it whatever we want. Go back to your original point. It is the mastery of weaponry. It has to involve weapons. I don't think it would be fair to say that Kali, like if I had an empty hand Kali system, I
yeah,
don't think I
like a
could call
yap
it.
or something. Yeah,
You're right. I wouldn't be able to call it a Kali system.
yeah.
And the thing is, if you go to the Philippines, you'll see things like Yao Yan. You'll
Hmm.
see kind of a resurgence of Sikaran or, these other empty-handed Filipino martial arts because not necessarily because that's what Filipinos are facing on the street. They're not fighting empty-handed on the street still, but that is what martial arts is to them. It
Yeah.
is an empty hand style. It's reflecting upon what is big now in the martial arts world, which is MMA.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
for them, that is what a martial art should look like. And so I think a lot of, and I think that there's this one of our flaws as Filipino martial artists is that, yes, I believe it's important to be well-rounded, but I think it's like too many Kali guys try to be everything to everyone. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, we have stick, but we also have blade, and we also have empty hands. We have all of that. And I'm like, well,
Yeah.
yes and no. I mean, we do, but we're really good at this. And there's certain
Yeah.
Kali styles that are really good at certain things. Like Sa Kali, it has everything, right? I mean, from the mindset, the thought process, everything to how the information is distributed, to the blade, everything has stick fighting, everything.
Hmm.
But it was really well known for the knife.
Yep.
It's what, and I think Manong Dan when he spoke to Tuan Harley, that's what he said. He's like, they're specialists. He referred to the dogs as specialists, right, in the knife.
Yeah.
Of course, they have a lot of other things that they have, and they're incredible. But when it comes to what they're known for, that's what they're known for, right? Atienza Kali, known for long blade, mostly long blade. Is that to say that Tuan Carl cannot fight with a 2-inch blade? Of course he can. Doesn't mean that we're not trained to fight with knives, but that's the basis of everything. If you look at something like San Miguel Eskrima, the basis of that art is stick and dagger, for the most part, or espada, not even sword and dagger. So, yes, Filipino martial arts involves the blade. Yes, it involves being well-rounded in all these areas. But I think it's important to note that as a Filipino Kali practitioner, you have to know that you're a weapons guy first.
Yeah.
Everything is after that.
Because Manny Pacquiao is not, I wouldn't say that's Kali.
Right.
Now, there's empty hand Kali that will overlap and probably look very much like that.
Right.
I wouldn't say it's Kali. Also, if you have, like those, there's all these Filipino like competitive shooters. They're like 3-gun or.
Oh God, yeah.
I mean, there's a long history of Filipinos that are like awesome shooters. I also wouldn't say that that's Kali because I think, and they are weapons, but I think it also goes back to what you were saying that it is weaponry. Mm-hmm. I agree. In some form, it has to connect to the blade. Now, maybe. Hundreds of years ago, they stopped and they just started using sticks and then whatever. I mean, maybe it doesn't now.
Right.
But at some point, there was some blade influence. That's what I would say.
No, absolutely. And I think for it to be a true Kali art, the true Filipino martial art, it has to have that element of edge awareness. Yeah. Movements have to understand, like one of the things that I've noticed is like a lot of, and you've probably seen this, like these guys, like, I teach Filipino martial arts, and I also do Muay Thai, and I also do Jiu-Jitsu. And when they fight, they just look like they're doing Muay Thai and Jiu-Jitsu.
Yeah.
But they don't look like they're actually doing Kali, and their Kali is very rudimentary. It's just like angle ones and roof blocks. I mean, there's nothing really going on. Or low leg shots, right? So there has to be this element of edge awareness. There has to be this element of respect for the weapon, not just the weapon of your opponents, but also the weapon you're holding, so you don't accidentally stab yourself, right? So there's this element of precision, and I think that's what I would describe it as. When I think of a true Kalista, a true practitioner of the art, it has to really, I would have to say it's Tuan Carl. I mean, I'm not saying that there's no other practitioners of this art, but when I think about in my mind what the quintessential Filipino style looks like, it would have to be Tuan Carl, only because he's fluid. Everything he does looks like he has a blade in his hand. If you look at footage of Tatang Ilustrisimo, Antonio Ilustrisimo, the vintage footage of him, same thing. Anything you put in his hand, it was like, it doesn't matter if he was doing empty hand work. It didn't matter if you were putting a stick in the hand. It was a blade. So I think that's what it would have to come down to. The blade is definitely a part of the whole formula. You know what I mean? And
I would say, Tohan Raff talks a lot about movement languages through different martial arts. So like Wushu has a different movement language than like Shotokan Karate,
right?
Or Muay Thai, or even Kali,
right?
And I would say that probably some things. I would probably say that there's some martial arts whose movement language is sort of like its signature. It's like its signature, and they rely on that movement language to signaturize the system. Does that make sense? So like something to Juan Carl, to Tatang Ilustrisimo, to any other like blade master.
Right.
And I exactly can picture what you've seen when I think the thing is with Kali, it's not the techniques. It's if not the techniques, if anything, it's the movement or the movement language that signaturize what Kali is. And so you can have a bunch of guys like rockin' robots that are just doing roof blocks and heavy number ones, but not that that's not influenced by the blade, but it's Tony Harley sometimes we'll talk about like generational gap or generational deficit from like one generation to another. There's some like residual loss either in skill or movement or knowledge or whatever it would be. I'd almost say a very similar thing too. So I'd probably say like the further people get from the blade, there's more variance or variation in that movement language. When people are moving, I mean, it's probably why universally there's certain movements, whether it's like fencers from Europe or France or blade guys from the Philippines. There's a lot of universals in those too, because its movement language is directly influenced by the call and the function in the form of a blade.
No, and absolutely, that's so true because the blade, it doesn't matter what culture it is. There is a language, like you're saying, a movement and a mindset. Like if you read Book of Five Rings by Miyamoto Musashi,
Yes.
I did not appreciate that book until I became an Atienza Kali instructor.
Yes,
Be-
100%.
right? Because when I read that, I hear Tuan Carl's voice.
Mm-hmm.
I hear his voice. I'm like, I'm reading this book and I'm like, these lessons are, it's like, I know what this feels like. I understand. A lot of guys read Book of Five Rings as like a business book or like a book on strategy for life. And yeah, I'm sure you could do that. But at the end of the day, that book was designed to teach swordsmen how to kill other swordsmen. And so when you study a real, true sword art like Atienza Kali, you're going to find that, that point of, where does it kind of drift? Where does, Filipino martial arts kind of go off the path? I would have to say it's, what we've been good at for thousands of years, which is blade work. And I'm not saying that's all the art should be. I know there's a lot of Filipino Kali purists who are like, I get these comments on my YouTube videos all the time. It's like, oh, you're not a true. I can tell these guys from the Philippines because one, their English is different, their Taglish is different, and two, they're like, you're just an American boy. You didn't grow up here. You don't know what this is all about. And I'm like, well, I could tell you right now that most of the masters in the world, and I get this question a lot. I was actually asked this by a karate black belt recently. He's like, I'm going to go to the Philippines soon. Like, who should I train with? And I'm like, honestly, dude, I'm not saying there's no good teachers there, but the best teachers in the world are probably here in the West right now.
Yeah,
they probably left. They're all here. And so, there's this idea of purity, Filipino Kali purity. What exactly is it? I mean, I don't know if we can, that's probably a topic for an entire different podcast episode. But being that we're talking about what Kali is, I think a pure Kali art, it's going to be kind of hard to define. It's almost like, I'm Filipino. I teach Filipino martial arts. But I also live in Texas. I eat adobo and I eat rice and I eat lumpia. Actually, what's interesting here in Texas, all the Filipinos that I've met, I'm not saying they don't call it lumpia, but they refer to it as egg rolls.
Yeah, I mean,
it is what it is because that's how they called it. I mean, that's when you describe it to non-Filipinos or non-Asians, it's like, this is an egg roll, right? So, I mean, but I also eat brisket. I eat tacos. I swing a kettlebell. Yeah. Kettlebells are not Asian. They are Russian. Am I supposed to stop swinging a kettlebell around? So I think there's definitely this sense of we got to kind of cancel out the idea of purity because a pure Filipino martial art really comes down to, the individual. And I think I even asked this to Tuan, I think it was Tuan Bong or Tuan Carl a few years ago. They're like, we are the Filipino in Filipino martial arts. Yeah. As a Filipino, it is your divine. And, when we talk about like the purity of a system, I mean, again, every Filipino martial arts, I mean, one of my favorite examples is Jose Rizal, the national hero of the Philippines. This is a guy who, he wasn't necessarily known as being a combatant, but there are, people and historical records stating that he was a fencer, he was a shooter, marksman. I believe I read somewhere that he was the first Japanese jiu-jitsu black belt in the Philippines. Like he actually traveled, he trained with a jiu-jitsu master and came back, and he was a black belt in the art. And no one in the Philippines had heard about jiu-jitsu until he came and brought about it. And there are some suggestions that he was an arnisador, that he opened up the first Arnis club in the Philippines. But, truthfully, he was a fencer. And I see there's this beautiful picture of him with a forward lunge and a thrust. I think he's fencing Juan Luna. And am I supposed to say, like, well, he did fencing. Does that make him less of a Filipino because he did fencing? Does it make Joey Marana less of a Filipino because he listens to hip-hop? Because last time I checked, hip-hop was not from Manila, right? Yeah. So there's this question of purity. There's this question of lineage. And I think a big part of that are, truthfully, Filipinos trying to... Like, when a Filipino from the Philippines accuses me of not being Filipino enough, I think they're doing that because they're asking, well, am I really Filipino enough? And I'm from the Philippines, Because they're asking themselves, like, people will ask them, well, isn't a Filipino just like an Asian, Mexican, like they'll say things like that. Well, no, there's more to it. We have Malay roots. We have Indian roots. We have Persian roots. We have, all the Spanish roots. I mean, we have all these different things. So I think because of our ethnic diversity and our this multiculturalism and colonialism that's happened over the last few hundred years, it's kind of hard for us to kind of put our finger on exactly what we are in a way.
I wonder if that's directly tied in then, to like this whole phenomenon of what is Kali, because there's a whole big thing about like, what does it mean to be Filipino?
Right.
Like what is it? Like in some ways, I mean, obviously you and I are American. My American identity is very strong.
Right.
Like it's very strong within me.
Me too.
Like I don't identify with any other nationality. And as an American, I feel like there's certain things that we can point to that have to do with being American that are not. We're not American because we speak English and because we eat McDonald's.
Right.
But when people talk about what it means to be Filipino, especially in the Philippines, I feel from an outsider's perspective, I feel like a lot of times it's like speaking Tagalog or whatever dialect and eating that food. So especially me, Joey Marana, when I go to places and people are like, oh, like, because I'm also a nurse. So when people are like, hindi na marunong Tagalog? And I'm like, no, you can barely say that. And they're like, oh, well, you're not Filipino. Or they're like, hey, hey, there's someone brought like leche flan. And I'm like, oh, actually, I don't really like leche flan that much. And they're like, what? So people, it's interesting. Filipinos will be like, well, you're really Filipino if you can speak the language and if you love the food.
Right.
But that's not what defines, like, I mean, there's many other things that define other identities and cultures. But I think the complex, or I don't want to say the problem, but like the challenge of defining what Filipino is in and of itself as a people or a nation or identity, I think is directly reflected in Filipino martial arts. And I don't think it's a bad thing.
Right.
I think it's because it comes from so many sources that can do all these different things. I think that's a good thing. It also makes it hard for you and I to go to whatever, so like some convention, martial arts convention, and be like, oh yeah, well, nowadays it might be different. It would be hard for us to go to elementary school, talk to a bunch of parents that don't know anything about martial arts in general at all.
Right.
Say, oh, well, we practice Kali, and we teach Kali, and they'll be like, oh yeah, I know what that is. Like people don't know what that is, and that's not a bad thing. It just makes it more of a. I think what it does is probably. Just like this actual conversation, it makes us really dive deep and think about like, well, what is it that makes us Kali? Because it's not a roof block and an angle one and a 5-count cycling drill. That's not what makes it Kali.
Right.
There's a lot of other things that are important to us, and I think those things are good. It's good that it's. I think it's in some ways it's good that it's multifaceted. Again, like what. Echoing a lot of Tone Raff's sentiments sometimes, like we don't pride ourselves in flying a simplicity flag. We're not like, hey, look at this simple solution. Like, look how ingenious we are. We have this simple solution. We are as complex as we need to be to make it fully functional to solve the problems that we need to solve.
Amen. Yeah, exactly. And so, when people talk about, I think I've written a blog about this in the past. I believe that eventually Kali is going to be the next big martial art. I think it's going to, not to say it's not a big martial art now, but right now, if you're a Kali practitioner, you're pretty much like, what is the image of a Kali practitioner? If I were to say, what's the image of a Taekwondo practitioner or a karate black belt or a judo or jiu-jitsu guy, like there's an image, right? And right now the Kali guy, it's like the dude with the sticks and the training knives, and he's in his garage and he's training in his garage, and it's kind of relegated to the backyard of the garage. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, we come from a background where that is how we learned. When I was interviewing Father Leo Paralinghug, Master Kakoy, the late Kakoy Cañete would be throwing him around in his backyard. I mean, that was just part of his life. I mean, it was just, there's this intimacy about Kali and Filipino martial arts that's very beautiful. I think a lot of people who are the quote unquote Kali purists, when they find out that I'm opening a martial arts school and I'm teaching a Filipino martial arts school, and I'm teaching Filipino martial art, teaching it, to everybody I can, it's almost like, and you're trying to open a school with mats, and that's not real Filipino martial arts. I think there's actually a Facebook group or something. It's like the garage martial artist group, and it's cool because you're training in your garage and you don't need any of that commercialism. But the truth is, I mean, there's going to be a point where Kali, and mark my words, Kali is going to be the next big thing in martial arts. Right now it's MMA. Every martial art that has essentially become the martial art of its era in America has always, the next art that looked like it could defeat the previous art was the art that everyone learned. So, like, great example, in the 80s, it was all about karate, right? 80s, 70s, karate, kickboxing, kung fu. And all of a sudden, this guy with a white gi called Hoist Gracie walks into an octagon and starts tapping these guys out, choking them out. Bigger guys, smaller guys, everyone in between. Didn't matter what style they came from. And all of a sudden, people go, that's what I need to learn. And then eventually people say, well, jiu-jitsu's awesome, but we got to put something else to it. Let's do MMA. So now people start fusing all these different things. Now, what is the only logical art that could defeat MMA? It has to be ours.
Yeah.
That's how it is. The blade defeats everything that you do, MMA guy. Like, that's just how it is. Now, I'm not saying it's bad. And in fact, I encourage my college students to, hey, listen, if you can meet up with an MMA guy and learn a few things, why not? Because there's a level of resistance. They have an element of athleticism and resistance. If you can deal with what they're doing, the average punk on the street's not going to be able to, hurt, punch you, or kick you. Mm-hmm. So there's an element that definitely a huge value of in MMA and learning it. But I would say that past that, Kali is the next level up. It is, and I was actually sitting down with a gentleman by the name of Robert Sapp. He's actually a Chun Cook Do black belt under Chuck Norris. He's part of the Kickstart Kids program alongside me. And he said to me, we're having breakfast at this recent conference, kind of like their Sama Sama or their Call of the Mountain. Like, it's this Kickstart Kids conference in Houston that's held once every year. And we're sitting at breakfast one day in the hotel, and he goes, Kali for me, he said, he's like, I've never had a whole lot of training in it. But he said, Kali, personally, for me, is that art that you learn after you learn everything else. When you realize that you've seen everything, Kali is like, that's what I need to learn.
But the other thing, though, I completely agree.
Yeah.
And I do think in a linear, logical progression, mm-hmm. You're exactly right. The other element, though, is I think a lot of, I mean, it's not without its origins and maybe even good reasons, but there is the whole element of I don't know. I think probably like a mix of denial, mm-hmm. a mix of fear, a mix of having the responsibility to acknowledge like certain things. I mean, in any true person that's interested in self-defense, I feel like has to at the very least consider firearms, right? But you can have karate guys decades deep in whatever karate system and will not want to touch a gun,
right?
And still think, and I've heard this from karate guys, that if your pure karate is good enough, that you don't need to learn anything about guns. And that's, I mean, mm-hmm. Who knows? Maybe that's true. And because I'm not a karate guy, maybe I just don't have the secrets and I don't have the insight.
You don't have the dim mock, Guro Joey. Come on. You don't have the death touch, man.
But from my perspective, I certainly think you're absolutely right, mm-hmm. But there is this whole like movable, emotional process where people at some point will be like, well, this is going to change the game. Once I acknowledge this, mm-hmm. then it's not just about learning like a stick form or a knife pattern or even how to or even buying a gun. It would have to increase everything. And that's I think that's why things like Sayo Kali or Atienzo Kali can seem probably overwhelming to some people because it's so vast.
Right.
Because it's no longer just a technique. It's no longer like a two-man set, like some weird, what was that movie with where they had these gun katas? It's not that. I mean, if that's
Equilibrium. Yeah. That's right.
But it's really like a whole lot of things. And once you acknowledge that, then guess what? You better think about how to deal with how to manage a situation when your family's with you. Mm-hmm. If you do not have a blade, if comms are down, if someone gets medically, needs some medical intervention, if you're with it just opens up a whole nother thing. And in my opinion, that's a very scary and daunting thing to even have to accept. And so if I accept that that's a reality, mm-hmm. I have to do these things, or I have to accept the fact that I'm purposefully not doing them. Right. Or I can just choose to be in, kind of a weird denial and be like, well, what's the likelihood of that actually happening? And
Right.
this whole other thing. So
Right. I think we go through that a lot, especially as colleague guys. It's like, well, when are you going to need to know how to use a knife?
yeah,
First of all, I mean, I live in Texas, and this state is a gun loving state. I mean,
yeah,
that's what it's kind of a stereotype, but I mean, and living here in the Dallas area, I mean, that is true to some extent. I mean, if I tell people I teach knife combat, they're like, oh well, why don't you just shoot the guy? That's kind of
yeah,
a common thing. And the other end of the spectrum on the martial arts end, if you talk to the MMA guys or the Muay Thai guys, it's like, well, why would you have to do that? Like, what do you think? Are you
yeah,
a criminal? So it's like we're in a very unique kind of place. But I think in the next few years, and I think this would actually make a really great podcast episode. Kali the next big thing? I think that'd be a great topic.
yeah, yeah,
But what
yeah,
I mean? It's like, but I think without getting into it too deep, because I do want to kind of tie this off, because we could go. You and I can go on for like hours. I mean, this could be like a 10-hour episode. I really do think that as a Kali practitioner, it's gonna be your responsibility, my responsibility, our generation's responsibility to kind of carry on that torch to the next one. Like right now, as my son's in the other room and he's playing, and I don't know if he'll ever take Kali as seriously as me. I would hope that it is going to be part of his life. I don't know if it will be. He's going to be, an instructor or whatever. I mean, that's what I would love to groom him for. But of course, I want him to pursue his dreams, whatever they may be. But I do know that for our generation, it's our duty now to kind of carry that on, to carry that torch, to keep that fire burning for that next generation. And to do that, we need to know who we are as Kali practitioners. We need to know what Kali is, right?
yeah,
And we need to know how it differentiates from everything else. I when I would mention, oh, I'm a weapons guy. I think when I would go to these Kickstart Kids karate conferences, I would sit down with a room full of black belts, and I'd sit down with a group of guys I didn't know. Oh, what do you do? Oh, I am a weapons guy. I don't say I'm going to scream a door. I'm like, I'm a weapons guy. I'm not saying I can't do other things, but that's what I do. And the moment they say weapons guy, the first thing that pops in these guys' heads, I'm one of those dudes with a plastic staff that twirls it around on stage. On ESPN2, they think I'm like the guy who flips the commas and all that stuff. I'm like, no, I'm not that guy.
yeah,
That's not. I know that in their mind they've already created a picture.
yeah,
I mean, no, that's not me. I'm not that weapons guy. I'm not the weapons forms guy. I'm part of a system that teaches you how to use weapons for real. And then that goes into a whole different plane of thought for them. They don't understand why that's even valid. But I think that it's good. We definitely got into a lot of really good things today. I think it's really good that we were able to define it. And, the idea that Kali is more than just a set of techniques. It's more than a way a system looks. It's the mindset. It's the blade mindset, the tribal family mindset. And also it is a mindset of what solves the problem that's in front of you. You know what I mean? Yeah. So you have anything else to add?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, this topic can obviously, like what you said, can branch off into a million different streams and different directions. It's funny with the MMA or martial arts guys, and then how they interpret, especially like blade guys. I'm part of group, someone, my actual friends in real life who I, have some interaction with. That's just more than just responding to threads, where people will criticize Kali to talk about how like these knife disarms or whatever just would never work in real life. They'll never work in the street. And I will be like, yes, I agree. But then they don't want to learn how to use a weapon offensively. And so it's just it's just a weird thing. I think some of it too is not necessarily our responsibility, but I think definitely for our own tribe, our own families, and our own networks to try to convey the relevance of that. Like what kind of like echoing what you said, my son may never be so into Filipino martial arts as I am, but just like with exercise or diet or like treating his significant other, respectfully, you don't have to be an exercise fanatic. You don't have to exercise and movement. That should always be part of it. Like as not just part of his family, and I would assume with part of yours too. They can do whatever they want, except that we won't really allow them to be worthless.
Right.
You know what I mean? So there are parts of he can do whatever he wants to a point. I'm not gonna let him just like sit around and do nothing.
Right. No, absolutely.
but certainly like I think it was good to help define what Kali is, with the understanding that there's some, I don't want to say strict parameters, but there's some definitive parameters.
Right.
And then there's a whole lot of expression in it too. And I think that's part of Kali too.
Right.
You know, that like Pamana Tohan would call it Icho, you know, like everyone has their own. And so the way that one person does things doesn't necessarily mean it would look the same if you did it in the truest expression of what you were trying to do.
Right.
So
absolutely. Dude, this was an awesome discussion. We'll definitely bring you back on, and we're going to talk about a gajillion other topics, I'm sure. Yes. But dude, thank you for joining me today, man. It was a lot of fun catching up and talking about this, man. I always love talking to you, bud.
We'll have to do the other one, like the Marvel team up kind of thing, where you're on my podcast too.
Dude, yeah, we'll make it happen. Yeah, man, this is an awesome time. Thank you, brother. I appreciate it, man.
Yeah. All right, Mike.
All right, buddy. Soon. All right, guys, so that is my interview with Guro Joey Marana out of Baltimore, Maryland. Guys, thank you so much for tuning into episode 11. And if I could kindly ask if you guys could leave a review for us on iTunes. It really means a lot to us. It helps our page visibility and definitely helps get the Bayani Warrior message out there. Guys, thank you so much for tuning in. I'll see you in episode 12. Take care, God bless, and become the hero in your life.